Pizza Steve TV. In this episode of The People, we will have part 2 of our interview with Joe Harris as he takes us to his hometown in West Virginia in the town of Hinton and shows us his grandfather's church that they built, as well as his old stomping grounds. And you know, Joe Harris has lots of stories to tell, so join us for part 2. This is where brother and sister Elder spent all day making up great batches of dough in a big kettle. And then they put big bread in these loaves like this and build a big fire in there. Let it burn out, shovel out the ashes, and the bricks would hold the heat. Then put 55 loaves of bread in at one time. They'd bake it very uniformly. Just pull them in, bake them, pull them back out. You step on that. This is barbed wire. I don't guarantee I found the best way to come up here, but we'll get there. This is all very accessible in the country. We're going up the road. And I always take the weirdest back roads possible. And I saw on the map this one tiny blue line. I said, that's our road. One place we had to cross a creek and cut a sapling. And then we got close to the West Virginia line, and it was a very narrow path. At the top, there was a wide expanse intersecting what we were on. It was much nicer than what we were on. And the sign said that was the Appalachian Trail. Oh. So I've encountered the Appalachian Trail a couple of times. I'm looking for a Yancey here. Here's a Hatfield. This was a member of our church, Talmadge Reed. I believe he was a school teacher. He was a veteran of World War II, and he was a very good friend of my Uncle John Nathaniel, who married the Jewish lady. I knew him, and he was in ham radio, so I was a friend of him. But there were a lot of stories I even included in my memoir of John Nathaniel. When they were boys, they were determined to go swimming in New River in January. Oh. And they went. Oh. They said afterwards they were pushing up rocks and everything, trying to get exercise and get warmed up. And it was written up in the paper as young hopefuls. Another story, he said that during biology class one time, he and my Uncle John Nathaniel were taking fingerprints off the aquarium. And all at once John Nathaniel said, say photosynthesis. He said, photosynthesis? And the teacher said, that's correct. Teacher had asked a question, I think it was photosynthesis. He had asked a question, John Nathaniel listened to it, but Francis was not listening. So he was giving him the answer, and the teacher said, you're correct. He wrote at least one article for a radio magazine about the design of a certain circuit that he had developed. And he wrote another story, I don't know whether he ever published it, but in World War II, there was one of the Allied pilots who was down in enemy territory, and the commanding officer said, you know, I'll let you guys talk about it, but I understand if you don't want to volunteer for the rescue because it's dangerous. After the commanding officer left, they said, well, it's a shame we don't make some effort. So they went at great effort and rescued the downed pilot. While they were gone, their home base was bombed. So that's the kind of writer he was. But he was a real friend to me as a younger kid, you know. He was a great friend of my uncle growing up. Babe was his nickname, and I think his brother used to visit Mount Olivet Church here. I didn't know him, but they called him Happy. Oh. Anyway, a little history on one of my older friends here.
We're encouraged to try to start a certificate program. And then we are.
When I was in college, I went down a new gravel road that I'd never been on before. At the end, this man was 70 years old and asked who I was. Okay, so he said, what's your name? I said, Joe Harris. He said, are you Reverend Harris's son or grandson? I'm both. Jewish girl who was studying sociology, and they used to go sing old-fashioned songs like I'll Fly Away. They'd sing together. I guess I knew Joy and she was friends with this girl named Elvina, and I think I had called for a date with Joy, and she declined, and then I called Elvina as sort of a second choice, and we went for a hike, and it turned out well. We went for a hike and found out that she had done some teaching and had been a literature major. Well, the time came when I invited her to come to West Virginia to visit, so she came up on a bus, and she told me when she came that she had cleared it with her parents. Now, she was in graduate school already, but was still pretty much geared to her parents' permission. Well, anyway, I met her in Beckley, and we came back, and then I had this handicapped uncle who was autistic or whatever, and we invited him to go with us to an outdoor drama, which is real interesting at a very scenic state park. And anyway, we brought him back home, and then she and I went for a drive. It rained hard, and then it had cleared, and the full moon came out, and the valleys were filled with fog, and the hills sticking up like islands. We drove up to Brother Bennett's driveway up there and sat there all night and just talked. And at one point I said, would it bother you to tell you I love you? You know, the feelings were developing quickly. Now this is called Broomstraw Road. But anyway, we were here all night in a real romantic setting. That was in Brother Bennett's driveway. Well, he knew that I had a... Is that my phone?
Easily, South Carolina. You want to answer it?
Well, let's see who it is. Hello? Click. It's one of those robocalls, I guess. Yeah. So anyway, we were here all night, and to back up a little bit, when my oldest son and older sister started college, my father encouraged my mother to start in college with them. So here they were in the same classrooms, and it made papers several counties around, but this older person being in college with their children. Well, it didn't help their social development, but anyway, one night my son had a date, and he came back about midnight. My father had built a house over in this college town, and my father had to come to the door and unlock, and I guess my father was a little disapproving of my oldest brother coming in at midnight. He said, John, I was afraid maybe you had a car wreck or something coming in so late. John said it was a good thing he didn't turn on the light, because he might see all the red on his cheeks and decide it was blood. So anyway, that was my father's attitude with my oldest brother dating. Well, here I came in. This girl and I came in at 6 o'clock in the morning. She went upstairs to bed. I went down the basement to my bed. 1 hour later, my father came and said, how'd you sleep? I said, pretty good, what there was of it. And he just laughed. So that shows how a parent can change, you know, over the period of years. But anyway, that marriage failed for a couple reasons. And, anyway, but I just wanted to give you a little personal history of this spot here. Talking about an older lady he had been dating for a while. He visited here, and he said, thank God it did not work out. And I think so many things, the thing we look at as negative, turn out to be positives. The breakup of that first marriage was a very positive development, which I would, you know, struggled under, but I felt I'd done my homework, and once I made my decision, never had one single regret. Now this is the road before it was paved. I tried to ride my bicycle to church here instead of going around the main road. And the mud and clay was so dense, I would have to stop and dig the mud out before I could even push the bicycle. So I was 30 minutes late getting to Sunday school, afraid my father would reprimand me, but no, he congratulated me for my courage. A lot of positive things I could say about my father. First of all, there was an outhouse on the far side which was no longer being used. It had 2 or 3 positions. And later I used that as my little radio room, where I'd put a homemade receiver. And then my older brother, as a joke one time, put a dead chicken in there to aggravate me. But anyway, we never used that. But then I remember they had built an outhouse here. They moved it from one location to this location. So when I was growing up, this was the only bathroom facility we had, no running water in the old house. But we had so many Reader's Digest to read. My grandmother called it the library. Well, in the wintertime, I would bring a kerosene lantern to put between my legs and a cat to put on my lap to keep warm. Well, anyway, this had caved in, and I wish I had gotten a picture of it. It was leaning over and rotted up, and it was, Craig called it the Leaning Tower. And Naomi thought that would be a nice project for me. But first we had to work on the porch down there that you see. And I redid a lot of the framing overhead and one thing, and the posts were in poor shape. So I did a lot of repair work there. And then Craig and them painted it. But then I got onto this, and so I took all the old lumber, took that apart, saved what was usable, and then we got down to the seat. There's a concrete floor, and the seat is concrete, and that was left, and then that was placed on a rim here. And Roger is one of the neighbors, has a backhoe. He lifted it off to the side, and he dug out stones this big, and I don't know where they came from. But anyway, we finally got down to solid rock, and then I put forming in there to make a concrete base and laid concrete blocks around very conscientiously. And then he came back and set this back on here, and then I built all the superstructure above. And the interesting thing, if you look, the original carpenters had built it with just 2-inch lumber, thick lumber, and you see it's toenailed. And the typical stud is this way, but this is put this way to save space, and it looks better. So I duplicated that, and I used screws all the way through. And then I made this seat here, the lid, and I made this seat. And so anyway, during the Depression, there was one of the members of the church was employed making little models of outhouses for the public. And this was one of those built according to those specs. And they even had a wooden tunnel up here and to try to ventilate it a little bit. But so anyway, this was one of my projects 2 years ago. This is the original door, which I was able to save. This is the original barn. At one time my father had 6 milk cows here, and he would sell milk in Hinton. As I understand, sometimes the snow would be so deep he could not drive to town, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, he would walk the 6 miles to town, carry milk and deliver it, and then be at the post office to deliver mail all day. And I never considered him particularly strong. This barn is interesting. People used to say he put more effort in building the barn than he did the house. But he actually made the upstairs divided, so in case the house ever burned, he could turn this into a residence. The pasture here was very rocky, but he had 6 stalls. I wish I could show the inside. It was made with stanchions, and I remember the name of each cow from the time I was 6 years old. And my father used to have a man who worked here by the name of Charlie Charlton. I think he had been injured, and I guess he was a little nervous or something, but he used to work here. My father helped preach the funeral for old brother Charlie. And that night, my father had a lantern here and was milking, and he said that first cow became extremely frightened. That cow saw something he did not. And I remember the cow, very gentle. Her name was Pearl. And he wondered if old brother Charlie might have come back. And he prayed that whatever it was be removed. But, you know, some things happen mysteriously, you know. But there was Pearl, and then Blackie, Rose, Spot, and the one we called the Heifer. And then over here was one we called Betty, and she was very stubborn. When you had to breed her, we didn't have a bull here, so she wouldn't be led, so my father would tie a rope to her to the back of the Buick, and then he'd go down the road, and the cow would be following along to go over to Marvin Deeds' bull. Anyway, my mother said that Betty always does the opposite, so my sister said what you need to tell her is the opposite, and then she'll do the right thing. Father used to keep hay up there, and one time my brother and I were up there, and it started raining, and two neighbors came by and took shelter down below. And they didn't know we were upstairs, and they were wearing hats, and my brother and I were taking little pieces of sand and dropping through the crack to go in the brim of their hat. But anyway, I have a lot of memories here. But he sold the cows when I was about 6 years old. And then later, we learned the game of ping pong, and we had run electric wire to the barn, and from there over to the house, which is Danny's house up there now. My brother built a crude table out of rough lumber, and we didn't have plywood, we just used boards, and so we'd play ping pong, and sometimes the ball would hit a crack, and we'd call that a crack, and that did not count. During the spring flood time, there was a girl that I knew. She lived up that way. We borrowed a boat, and I was going to ride the boat with her on the Greenbrier River. I didn't know going through the rapids it could be that swift, you know, and it was a little flood time, you know. We went through 3 rapids, and I decided that was enough. So I stripped down to my briefs, and I pushed the boat back up with her in it. But what I've always wanted to do is to take a boat ride all the way from Alderson down the river around the big bend where the railroad tunnel is and come into Hinton. My friend in Berlin rode the train from Alderson down to Hinton one time. It's the C&O Railroad. Wherever he goes, he always learns a lot about the history. He went up through North Carolina, I think Moravian Falls, and stopped and asked people about the history of the Moravians and all like that. So he learns more about the area than the locals. That's when a lot of people see the local country, is when they have a visitor. They show them things that they have never seen themselves. Which is now the library. And this was a department store. And out here is a blank area, but when I lived here, that was a 3-story residence, and then this is the department store where I worked. 2 sides of the street had windows, and on Halloween we'd have to clean all the soap off of those. And then there was an Italian family. One of the young boys had a radio shop here. His uncles and father had a shoe repair business here. This was where the old Masonic building was, which apparently is not functioning now. But this was a high school I attended, and it burned when I was a senior. And we had some classrooms in the Masonic building. And we had the psychology class met in the men's restroom of another building.
In the restroom?
Yeah. It was the coach that was teaching that. And earlier, this was called Central School. And I attended elementary years there, and later they added a second story for the high school too, but that all has been condemned because of asbestos now. The first girl I ever called for a date lived in one of those houses, and when we first moved to town, we moved to one apartment and later moved to this house, which is where my grandmother Caulfield and her husband lived, and this is one of the houses that we rented later. Anyway, it needed a lot of repair, and we used to refer to it as the shack. When we moved out of here, my mother wrote in the dust on the windowsill, "Goodbye, old shack. We'll not be back until you get the things you like." And the landlady noticed it later and joked about it. So many memories of this house. We used to go up on the hill, and there was a creek that ran down through here, and we used to play war games up there, and I used to play in the creek, and my grandfather Caulfield made a little wooden water wheel which we put in the creek and watched it spin. When we first moved here, my mother was giving piano lessons. And we made friends with this family up here, and my mother encouraged them to take piano lessons. And they said, well, we don't have a piano. So my mother said, I'll sell you mine, and we'll buy another one. So there was a good relationship between the two families for years. Finally, in high school, I got the courage to call her and ask if she'd like to go to a basketball game. And she said, no, I have to study. And I imagine she was as scared as I was, but I was so shy when I saw her around town later. But she was one of my mother's best piano students. And my mother would say, now Marilyn is up to this point, already advancing beyond me on the piano. Finally, I thought, it's not worth the competition, you know. That just wasn't my expertise, and so I let her. And for years, she played for piano in the west end of town here, and was very proficient on the piano. She never married. She had two younger sisters, and I guess they married. But she used to come to the family reunions, and finally was very stooped, you know, but she died some years ago. But anyway, that was some of my high school experiences here. I'd had a previous marriage that was unsuccessful, and my previous wife had told me about this organization. If my previous wife and I had met through this organization, it would never have happened. There was one question that would have turned her off. Would you like to live in Alaska? But anyway, I knew about this organization. A year or so after I had my divorce, I was employed, and I thought, well, I'll try to take the guesswork, and I wrote an application to this organization. I got a mailing return with the same address as where my previous wife was, Savannah, Georgia, and I thought, oh no, another one. I wrote a letter, and you didn't have anything to go on, except this organization thought you had something in common. So I wrote my first letter and told her a few of my interests and where I was living. I'd bought property with the creek. To the organization, I had specified I'd like to find someone who would be comfortable either in a concert or camping, equally comfortable with a farmer or college president, someone who would not mind my preference for cold weather and rural life, and someone who would be comfortable around a foreign language. And if you can't find locally, I'm frequently in West Virginia in the Midwest. Well, here came this return with a Savannah address, but it was postmarked Detroit, Michigan. So I said, well, at least she's been north of Mason-Dixon line. Well, the first letter came back with all these interesting things. She'd grown up a farm in southwest Minnesota, which was rather dry, and from a Dutch family. We wrote several letters. My third letter, I believe, was 13 pages long. She said she wouldn't try to match that. A few months later, we decided to meet. I flew to Chicago, and she was driving back from Minnesota to Detroit with her sister, and I met both of them at the O'Hare Airport, and then her sister flew on to Detroit. And then she and I drove back, and we stopped in southern Illinois where one of my professors lived, and we went out to supper with him and his sisters, and we drove back. She was reporting in a news article, I guess the interview was too intense. She had developed this tick in her eye, and she couldn't wait to leave after she dropped me off at my property. Too much interviewing all at once. And I probably gave her too much personal history. But anyway, she left my driveway, the tick was gone. We saw each other every weekend except one, and decided to get married at Christmas time. Her father offered me coffee, and I declined. He said, if you're going to be a Dutchman, you'll have to drink coffee. I said, you come down to Appalachia, I'll make you drink sassafras tea. And he never bothered me after that. But during that first meal, her brother was there and knew I was in philosophy. And he said, I'd like to give you a tentative definition of philosophy. I would give $25 if I had written down what he said. It was so complete. And he was not a philosophy major, but all I could remember was, and dealing with life's values was how it ended. So for his obituary, I included that. I have good and bad memories of my previous marriage, but the bad memories predominate. And I have a few bad memories of my second marriage, but the good memories predominate. And I say in any marriage, there's two things. There needs to be compatibility, and there's a lot of that lacking in my first marriage, and there was a lot of that present in my second marriage. The second thing is commitment, and there was a lot of lack of commitment in the previous marriage, and a lot of it in the second marriage. fact, we had financial challenges, and for 2 years, Marcia and I went to a professional counselor to talk about, our challenges in marriage. We had two, a boy and a girl. They were 5 years apart, and the girl is living up the road from us, and the son is out in Texas now, and they've chosen to completely eliminate communication with us. That's very unfortunate, because it's quite a change from what it was before, call each other every week, birthdays. Now there's none of that. Even as my wife was approaching death, the social worker called and, "Would you like to send a message?" He said no. They moved up from Savannah to help take care of Marcia. There's been challenges there, but I'm sure Marcia and I fared so much better with their care. And if without their care, Marcia and I, or both, would have died sooner.
'Cause it's like working a garden with this old hoe. That's what it takes to make it grow. Spending some time on your knees, pulling weeds. Oh, and planting seeds. He said, "Son, read your Bible, kneel and pray. Teach your children the Christian way, and plant some seeds of love wherever you go. 'Cause it's like working a garden with this old hoe. That's what it takes to make it grow. Spending some time on your knees, pulling weeds. Oh, and planting seeds." Now that I'm grown, with kids of my own, now I hope they see in me that when I'm in need, I fall on my knees and send up to God my plea. It's like working a garden with this old hoe. That's what it takes to make it grow. Spending some time on your knees, pulling weeds. Oh, and planting seeds.
Thank you guys very much. Pizza Steve, always eat your crust. Good night.